8 minutes, one question, and a president from Africa made Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett break down in tears live on television. But what could one man possibly say that made an entire studio go quiet like they were mourning something too sacred to speak of? It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a scandal. It was a story, raw, honest, and human. A story that didn't come from a podium, but from pain. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. But with one sentence, he shattered the illusion of power and reminded the world what leadership truly looks like. Hope doesn't come from speeches. It comes from funerals. In the next few minutes, you'll hear a story that blends heartbreak with dignity and silence with strength. While this narrative is fictional, the emotions it carries, the injustice, the grief, the quiet resistance, are very, very real. Because sometimes a made-up story can tell the truth better than the headlines ever will. This isn't politics. This is a story about what it means to carry the weight of others when the world forgets them. And now you're about to witness the moment that made millions stop scrolling and start feeling. The room was colder than expected. Not from the air conditioning, but from the atmosphere. It was that kind of manufactured stillness you only find in high-stakes interviews, the kind where truth is rarely spoken aloud and everything feels just a little too rehearsed. Cameras blinked in standby mode, crew members whispered behind clipboards, and soft LED panels cast a gentle, almost artificial warmth across the set. Polished, quiet, predictable. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett adjusted the lapel of her tailored blazer, exhaled once, and glanced at the clock just off camera. She had done dozens of these interviews before, diplomatic meet and greets that looked good on paper but rarely left anything behind. This was supposed to be the same. Another continent, another leader, another tightly scripted conversation with polite smiles, vague promises, and pre-approved sound bites. This time, Burkina Faso. When her staff first told her she'd be interviewing the president, Ibrahim Traoré, she had to Google him. Youngest head of state in Africa, the search had said. A former soldier, anti-colonialist, controversial. But there wasn't much else. No big press tours, no TED Talks, no viral speeches. Just a man behind a title. And not much media surrounding either. Jasmine had expected a strong, militaristic presence, maybe even arrogance. After all, most world leaders like the stage. They know where the camera is. They perform for it. But when the side door creaked open and he stepped inside, there was no fanfare, no entourage, not even a press officer. Just Ibrahim Traoré, in a modest dark jacket, shoes dusty from the outside, and eyes that looked like they'd seen far too much for someone his age. He didn't walk in like a president. He walked in like a man who didn't want to be there, but had to. President Traoré, Jasmine stood and offered her hand. He took it gently. Not like someone asserting dominance, but like someone who knew the value of touch. Especially in a world that takes too much from too many. His grip was warm, but his eyes, they weren't focused on the set, not on the cameras, not even on her. They lingered just for a second on an empty chair off to the side of the studio. She noticed it too, but said nothing. The producer gave the silent cue. The crew shifted in place. Someone whispered, 3, 2. The lights intensified slightly. The hum of the camera kicked in. And like that, they were live. What the world saw was a clean frame. 2 figures seated comfortably across from each other in front of a soft ochre backdrop. Their names gently lit on the chyron below. The kind of visual that screams civil diplomacy and nothing more. What the world didn't see was that Jasmine's hand resting on her knee had just started to tremble. Not from nerves, but from instinct. There was something about this man, something off-script. She opened the conversation the way she always did, polished, neutral. "Mr. President, thank you for joining us today. I know your schedule is demanding and your country faces complex challenges." He nodded slowly. "We're used to complex." His voice was calm, unshaken, but too calm, like someone who had practiced how to stay composed after breaking down one too many times in private. He was Jasmine blinked. She wasn't sure why, but she felt the urge to ask something real, something unapproved, something not on the card in front of her. "May I ask, just between us, before we begin formally, how do you personally keep hope alive with everything your country has been through?" It wasn't meant to be the real first question. It was a warm-up, a moment of shared humanity before the political dance began. But something shifted. He didn't answer. He looked down. The room waited. The producer motioned for her to move on, but Jasmine didn't. And then Traoré looked up. Not as a president, not even as a guest, but as a man carrying something heavy. "Hope," he said quietly, "doesn't come from speeches. It comes from funerals." The air changed. Someone in the control room coughed. A camera operator froze behind the lens. Jasmine felt something drop inside her chest. This was not going to be the interview she thought it was. And something told her, whatever he was about to say next, the world was not ready to hear it. It was supposed to be a transition, a soft moment before the policy talk, a warm human buffer before they launched into numbers, security agreements, and the usual dance of diplomacy. But when Jasmine Crockett asked, "How do you keep hope alive when you've lost so much?" she didn't expect it to land the way it did. She didn't expect him to pause. Not like that. He didn't frown. He didn't flinch. He just stopped. For a second, Ibrahim Traoré sat completely still, eyes low, breath shallow, hands resting calmly on his knees, like they had done this before, like they had held grief too many times to bother shaking. The room, already quiet, turned heavy. Not tense, just full. Full of the kind of silence that doesn't wait for answers, but listens for truth. Jasmine opened her mouth slightly, unsure whether to retract the question or restate it. But then he looked up, not at the camera, not at the floor, but directly at her. No bravado, no smile, just an unfiltered kind of gaze that made her spine straighten and her heart retreat half a step. "Hope," he said softly, "doesn't come from speeches. It comes from funerals." He said it like it was a memory, not a statement, like it was something he'd said to himself in the mirror, over and over, until it became more than just words. Jasmine didn't speak. Couldn't. The line hit her in the chest, not because of what it said, but because of what it meant. The way he said funerals, without hesitation, without dramatics, as if it were a place he visited often, as if loss had been more familiar than applause. The studio froze, not in shock, but in recognition. A camera creaked slightly on its pivot, but no one adjusted it. No one moved. Even the usually assertive producer, seated behind the glass with notes in hand, didn't signal for a follow-up. Something had shifted. The air felt altered. The lights suddenly seemed too bright for the weight in the room. Jasmine's fingers, still resting on her notes, began to curl slightly. Her well-prepared list of economic prompts and security talking points suddenly felt irrelevant, like a stranger in a conversation that had turned painfully personal. "I'm sorry," she whispered, instinctively. though she didn't know what for. For asking? For making him relive something? For not expecting honesty in a place built for performance? But Traoré only gave a faint shake of his head. His eyes didn't leave hers. "You asked me about hope," he said, slower now, the words dropping like stones into a quiet lake. "But in my country, hope isn't a light. It's a shadow we follow, because we've buried the ones who carried it before us." Jasmine felt her throat tighten. She wasn't prepared for this. Not emotionally, not spiritually. She had come to discuss development plans, anti-terrorism efforts, GDP statistics. But now, she was staring into the face of a man who had lived on the edge of grief for so long. He had learned to lead from it. She glanced toward the camera, then back to him. "Do you think people understand that?" He didn't answer immediately. He just folded his hands together, thumb rubbing softly over knuckles, weathered not by age, but by experience. "No," he said finally. "Most think power protects you from pain. But here, pain is why we lead, not what we escape." That was the moment she knew. This wasn't an interview. It was a confession. And she wasn't just a journalist. She was a witness. And something inside her told her, with growing certainty, that what came next would not just change how she saw him, but how she saw leadership, forever. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between Jasmine and Traoré stretched just long enough to feel intentional, like both knew they had crossed an invisible line and there was no going back. Jasmine's eyes searched his face, but he didn't look away. He seemed calmer now, like someone who had already decided to tell a story he rarely, if ever, shared. He shifted slightly in his chair, hands still folded in his lap, then spoke, not as a president addressing the public, but as a man revisiting something fragile. "His name was Malik," he said, voice low but steady. "We grew up in the same village. We skipped school together, traded comic books, argued over football. He used to dream of being a teacher, said if he couldn't fix the world, at least he could teach kids how to survive it." Jasmine listened, her breath caught somewhere between awe and ache. "Traoré was guarding a school when the attack happened," Traoré continued. "We had intelligence reports, but no reinforcements, just rumors, just fear. Malik volunteered to stay behind, to buy time. Said it wouldn't be long, that someone would come." He paused for a beat, as if testing whether the next part could be said aloud without unraveling. "They shot him in the leg first. He bled for over 30 minutes. Still had his radio in his hand, still calling for help, still believing someone would come." Jasmine's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Her hand moved toward her lips, an unconscious reflex to keep the emotion from spilling out. But it was already too late. The pain in Traoré's voice wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud. It was quiet, in the way grief often is, measured, controlled, but unmistakable. "Where I got there," he said softly, he was still breathing, still holding on. "And I was too late." The words hit Jasmine harder than she expected. It wasn't the brutality of the moment that undid her. It was the dignity, the fact that Malik had waited, believed, and died with a radio in his hand, thinking someone, anyone, might come through. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. Not for political theater, not for the camera, but because something about the story, about the image of a friend holding on to hope while bleeding out in silence, was heartbreakingly familiar to anyone who's ever watched someone they love suffer in vain. "I buried him myself," Traoré added, almost as an afterthought. "In the same uniform he died in. I didn't wash it. I couldn't. I needed to remember what it cost him to believe in us." Jasmine wiped her face, now visibly shaken. She wasn't crying for headlines. She was crying for something more ancient, more personal. A recognition of loss that transcends borders, titles, even language. and as the studio remained impossibly still, she realized she was no longer conducting an interview. She was standing in a story far deeper than politics could ever reach. Jasmine didn't speak for a long time after he finished. She didn't have to. The silence said more than words could. Traoré's expression hadn't changed much. He didn't flinch, didn't fold into himself, but there was a heaviness to his breath now, like saying Malik's name out loud had stirred something he usually kept buried beneath duty and titles. She finally asked, gently, "Were you there when he enlisted?" He gave the faintest nod. "He didn't tell anyone, just showed up one day in uniform, grinning like a fool. I was already in the army by then, stationed near the capital. He said he couldn't let me have all the glory." His voice cracked slightly, but he cleared it before it broke. He was always like that. Brave, but never loud about it. Loyal to the core even when no one was watching. A small smile formed at the corner of Traoré's mouth, not of joy, but of memory. And then he began to speak. Not like a president giving an account, but like a boy remembering the friend who shaped his childhood. "He used to bring gao every morning," he said, using the local word for rice. His family didn't have much, but his mother would wrap a handful in cloth and he'd carry it like treasure. When I forgot my lunch, he never hesitated, just split it in half every time. Jasmine leaned forward, her hands clasped, as if by closing the space between them, she might understand more deeply what was being said. "He once got caught climbing the school fence," Traoré continued, a faint laugh under his breath. "Said he was trying to impress Awa, the new teacher. She had just moved from the city and he told her he could touch the sky." He paused, then added quietly, "He fell, broke his arm, but kept the flowers he picked for her in his other hand." Jasmine smiled softly, the kind of smile that's born from recognizing innocence that no longer exists. "I remember our last afternoon together," Traoré said, and now his tone had changed. Slower, more grounded. "It was dry season. We were walking home from school. He was kicking a rock down the path, talking about how one day he'd open a small school in our village. Said he didn't care if it only had 3 students, as long as they learned something he never did." There was a long pause before he added, "That was the last time we walked home together." The weight of the sentence dropped into the room like a stone in still water. Jasmine stared at him, now fully immersed in the picture he had painted. The dusty road. The boy with big dreams and torn sandals. The friend who always brought rice, even when there wasn't enough for himself. "I didn't get to say goodbye," Traoré said. "And maybe that's why he never really left me. Because some people don't disappear. They echo. In choices, in silence, in the way we walk into rooms, remembering we were once part of something purer." Jasmine swallowed, her throat tight again. "You lead because of him," she said, not as a question, but as a truth spoken aloud for the first time. "Yes," Traoré replied simply. "Not because I want power, but because someone like him should have lived long enough to see a school with his name on it." For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. No one on the set moved. And in that fragile stillness, Jasmine realized this interview wasn't about Burkina Faso anymore. It wasn't about policies, global aid, or diplomatic optics. It was about something much older, much more human. It was about a boy who shared his rice, fell for a teacher, and died holding a radio, believing someone would come. And maybe, just maybe, that's why Traoré now answers every call himself. Traoré's voice had settled into something quieter now, more personal, as if Malik's story had opened a door he hadn't walked through in years. Jasmine could feel it. This wasn't just a moment of reflection. This was a man peeling back layers he had kept hidden from the world. Slowly, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, His fingers moved carefully, almost reverently, as he pulled out something small and folded, a photo. Old, worn, creased at every edge like it had been opened and closed 1,000 times. He unfolded it slowly, smoothing it on his knee without looking down. Then he held it out to her. Jasmine took it gently, her fingertips brushing the thin paper. It was black and white, slightly faded, the ink beginning to dissolve into the texture of time. In the photo, 3 children stood barefoot in front of a mud house with a rusted tin roof. 2 boys, 1 girl. The smallest of them, a girl with a round face and tightly braided hair, stood in the middle. Her smile was hesitant, but full of life. "That's us," Traoré said softly. "Before everything changed." Jasmine kept looking at the girl. "Your sister?" she asked. "Aminata," he said. "She was the youngest, smartest of us all. She could memorize anything. Numbers, prayers, stories from the old men in the village. We used to call her the little chief." He smiled faintly, but the joy didn't last long. She died when she was 11. Jasmine's gaze stayed on the photo. She didn't have to ask how. She knew. But he told her anyway. "Malaria," he said, the word falling heavy. 1 week. That's all it took. We didn't have money for medicine. We tried boiling leaves, tying charms around her wrists, praying louder each day. But none of it worked. His eyes didn't move from the photo. "She was burning with fever. My mother carried her to the clinic in town, but it was too far, and the nurse had already gone home. I remember her voice the last night. She whispered to me, 'Don't forget me, okay?'" He paused, then added more quietly, "I haven't." Jasmine felt her hands tremble slightly. She handed the photo back, but Traoré didn't fold it this time. He looked at it for a long moment, before tucking it gently back into his pocket. "I promised her, at her grave," he said, "that I would never let another child die because they were poor." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The way he said it, with restraint, not rage, made the words even more powerful. There was no bitterness in his tone. Only a vow, worn thin by time but never broken. "I carry that promise into every decision I make, into every policy, every meeting. I don't care about headlines. I care about little girls like Aminata, who never got the chance to grow up." Jasmine swallowed hard. Her heart ached, not just because of the loss, but because of the quiet dignity he carried it with. He wasn't using the story to impress her. He was simply remembering out loud, and in that memory there was weight, purpose, and pain. She thought of all the leaders she had met, how so many of them spoke of vision and progress, but rarely spoke of graves or photos or promises made by children who died too soon. This was different. This wasn't ambition. This was debt. A sacred one. The kind that keeps a man awake at night, long after the applause fades and the cameras go dark. And in that moment, Jasmine realized he wasn't trying to change the world. He was trying to keep a promise to a little girl who once asked not to be forgotten. The studio monitors kept rolling, but it felt as though time itself had stalled. No one dared move. Even the overhead lights seemed to dim beneath the weight of what had just been shared. Jasmine could hear only 2 sounds, the distant hum of equipment and the almost imperceptible rhythm of Ibrahim Traoré's breathing. Steady, deliberate, as if he'd spent years practicing how not to break in public. She studied him now with different eyes. This was not the polished diplomat her briefing packet had described, nor the controversial soldier headlines liked to debate. The man in front of her was forged out of funerals and unfinished childhood dreams. A friend gunned down protecting students, a sister taken by a curable fever, a mother who carried hope across dusty roads long after her own strength should have given out. Power, she realized, had never been his destination. It was merely the tool he'd grabbed so no other child would need a charm and a prayer where medicine should be. Traoré exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that empties the lungs yet somehow leaves the heart heavier. His hands rested open on his knees, palms scarred, knuckles darkened by years of rifle grips and steering wheels and signing decrees that could never come fast enough. Jasmine saw, perhaps for the first time in her career, a leader who carried office not like a badge, but like a memorial stone. Every decision, every late-night order, every dawn inspection of underfunded clinics, each an act of remembrance for the names no longer spoken outside his own mind. The silence stretched, unbroken by camera cues or teleprompter prompts. Somewhere behind the glass, the producer's finger hovered above the talkback button, then withdrew. Even he understood. To intrude now would be sacrilege. The only soundtrack was the soft hitch in Jasmine's throat as she fought to keep her composure. A single tear slid down before she could stop it. She let it fall. This wasn't politics anymore. This was the geography of grief, and grief obeys no studio schedule. Finally, she drew a breath. But instead of her next scripted question, only a whisper escaped. "Thank you for trusting me with that." It was all she could offer, a fragile bridge between interviewer and witness. Traoré gave a small nod, acknowledgement, not approval. His gaze drifted to the edge of the set where that empty chair still waited, a silent placeholder for every life that had shaped his own. When he looked back, the resolve in his eyes made Jasmine shiver. She understood now. His calm was not absence of emotion, but mastery over it. His authority not bestowed by elections alone, but consecrated by loss. In that breathless interval, Jasmine felt the shape of the conversation change forever. She closed her folder of prepared notes and placed it gently on the floor. The real story was no longer in bullet-pointed policy, but in the quiet covenant between a man and the ghosts that walked beside him. And as the red tally light glowed above the main camera, broadcasting their stillness to anyone willing to see, she realized that the most powerful noise in the world can sometimes be the sound of two people saying nothing at all. Jasmine hadn't said much since the last answer. The interview had already wandered far from anything resembling a political script, and yet every word seemed more necessary than anything they'd planned. She was no longer interviewing a president. She was speaking to a man who carried the weight of memory as if it were armor, worn, dented, but never taken off. Traoré reached slowly into his jacket again, this time into a smaller pocket sewn into the lining, a place too hidden for mere convenience. His movements were deliberate, not secretive, but sacred. When he withdrew his hand, resting in his palm were three objects, none valuable by currency but priceless by meaning. First, he held up a tiny pair of shoes. They were no longer white, if they ever had been. They were torn at the edges, soles worn thin, laces uneven, the stitching on one side coming undone. Jasmine leaned in instinctively. They looked like they belonged to a toddler, but something about the way Traoré held them, not like an object but like a person, made her hesitate to ask. Still, he explained, his voice quieter than before. "These belong to a boy named Idrissa," he said. "I met him at a displaced persons camp. He had no parents, no proper clothes, just two plastic bags tied around his feet. I noticed him because he kept smiling, even when others didn't. He gave me these shoes before I left. Said, 'You can walk farther than me, Mr. President.'" Jasmine felt something hollow open in her chest. She didn't dare interrupt. 3 days later he died of pneumonia, Traoré added simply. They buried him in a cardboard box. I wanted to place the shoes with him, but his aunt asked me to keep them. She said he believed I would be different, that I'd remember him. He placed the shoes gently on the table between them, as if they could still feel. Then, reaching back into the same pocket, he unfolded a small photograph. Faded, cracked in the center, it showed a woman, smiling, seated on a wooden stool outside a clay home. Her hands were strong, fingers calloused from labor. Her headscarf had slipped slightly to one side, and her eyes held a pride that leapt through the decades. "My mother," he said. "She never went to school, couldn't read, but she taught me everything that mattered, how to give without expecting anything, how to walk with your head high even when your stomach is empty, how to forgive people who never asked to be forgiven." He traced the edge of the photo with his thumb, slowly, as if trying to keep her from fading any further. Then he added, almost inaudibly, "She died before I became president." I wish she'd seen it, not because of pride, but because she would have told me to clean my shoes before every meeting and to never speak with a full mouth. The image of this powerful, composed man still hearing his mother's voice about clean shoes and manners, struck Jasmine harder than any speech could. There was no theatricality here, just the simple, devastating reality of someone who had lost too much, too early, and yet carried those losses forward like living things. Then came the third item, a folded note, small, creased, handwritten. He placed it in front of her. "It's from a soldier," he said. "A young man named Jean-Baptiste. He was 23. He died protecting a school bus during an ambush. No backup, no armor. Just his body between the gunfire and the children." His mother found this in his notebook. Jasmine opened it carefully, reading the words aloud, her voice shaking. "If I die before seeing peace, tell the president I still believe he's the right one to finish what we started." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. Traoré looked at her and said, "These are not objects. These are the people I answer to. They're the ones in the room when I make decisions. They're why I never raise my voice, because their voices are louder than mine ever could be." And in that moment, Jasmine realized that real leadership isn't measured in titles or applause, but in the quiet weight of what and who you carry when no one else sees. Jasmine hadn't moved since reading the soldier's letter. The note still rested gently in her lap, as if any sudden motion might tear the silence that had settled between them. But Traoré, sitting across from her, seemed far away now, his gaze distant, unfocused. He wasn't looking at the present anymore. He was inside a memory. "She always made sure I ate first," he began, the words slow, measured, like he was stepping carefully over pieces of broken glass. "Especially on days when there was barely enough for one bowl." Jasmine watched as his hands instinctively moved to mimic emotion, cupping something small, invisible, as if he were still holding that old tin bowl from childhood. "I was 15. It was the dry season. The markets were bare, and the wells were emptying. My father had already passed, and my mother had started working at the river, washing clothes for others. Every coin she earned came home, soaked in the smell of soap and sweat." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, voice growing softer. "That night, we only had a handful of rice left. She cooked it, divided it carefully, told me she had already eaten at the river, smiled while she said it, laughed even, said something about how old women like her didn't need much." He exhaled, not out of frustration but reverence. Like remembering her required a different kind of breath. "I believed her," he said. "I ate it all, every last grain. She watched me the whole time, like it was her favorite show." Jasmine's heart clenched. She didn't speak. Couldn't. "It was only later," he continued, "when I overheard her telling a neighbor that she hadn't eaten in 3 days. She had saved every coin that week to buy my school uniform, skipped every meal so I wouldn't feel ashamed walking through the gates." His voice didn't crack, but something behind it shifted, like the edge of a dam slowly giving way. "She collapsed the next morning. I thought it was the heat, but it wasn't. Her body just gave up, quietly. She even smiled when she fainted, so I wouldn't panic. Jasmine looked down, blinking away the wetness in her eyes. The image of a mother smiling through hunger so her son could eat was unbearable. Too real, too human. Traoré straightened his posture slightly, but not out of pride, out of ritual, out of the burden of remembering. "Every time I eat," he said slowly, "I ask myself, did I earn this? Is this meal worth her sacrifice, her smile?" He wasn't asking for pity. He was asking for understanding, and maybe, in some way, forgiveness. For having survived when she didn't. Jasmine realized in that moment that the pain he carried wasn't just grief. It was guilt. A lifelong question mark, stitched into the lining of every jacket he wore, every banquet he attended, every policy he approved. He was not trying to prove himself to the world. He was trying to live a life worthy of the rice he once ate. Rice bought with love and starvation. And as she watched him gently reach into his coat and pull out a tiny, rusted spoon, clearly a keepsake from that era, she understood something profound. This wasn't a man haunted by the past. This was a man led by it. And in that truth, his silence spoke louder than any speech she had ever heard. The dining room was modest. No chandeliers, no polished silver. Just soft yellow lights, a simple wooden table, and the scent of grilled chicken and beans drifting through the air. Jasmine had expected formality. A carefully curated dinner with crystal glasses and scripted toasts. But what she found instead was something quieter, more intimate. And then she saw it. At the end of the table, tucked neatly into the corner, was a single empty chair. She hesitated before asking, "Are we expecting someone else?" Traoré looked at the chair without turning his head, as if he always knew it was there, as if its presence had long since merged with the architecture of his life. "No," he said softly. "That's for my brother, Adama." The name hung in the air like incense, familiar, sacred, and gone. Jasmine lowered her fork slightly. She didn't speak, but he continued, his voice neither mournful nor mechanical, just steady, like the telling of a ritual. "We were 17, just a year apart. He was taller, faster, smarter. People thought he'd be the one to make it out, to lead something, maybe even the country. I followed him everywhere. He hated boiled yam, always snuck it onto my plate. He used to tell stories at dinner, wild, ridiculous ones. Made my mother laugh so hard she forgot the world outside for a few minutes." He paused, eyes locked on the empty chair, and Jasmine could feel the table shift. Not physically, but emotionally, as if Adama was suddenly there, seated among them. "There was a raid," Traoré said. "I was supposed to be there too, but I left early to fetch water. It was only a few minutes, maybe 20. By the time I got back, the house had been turned upside down. He was gone." He didn't describe the raid. He didn't need to. The silence after told her enough. "I used to wonder if he called for me," he added quietly. "If he thought I'd come back in time. I never did." Jasmine looked back at the chair. Plain, worn at the edges, the seat slightly uneven. But now it felt monumental, as if it held more than memory, as if it carried the weight of a future that had never arrived. "I keep it here," Traoré said, finally meeting her eyes. "Not out of grief, but memory. Because I lead for those who never made it to this table." Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. The room was full, not with people, but with purpose. And for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to govern, not from ambition, but from absence. That night she chose to sit beside the empty chair, and together, in the stillness of that modest room, they ate. Not for the cameras, not for the audience, but for Adama. Who should have been there, telling stories, stealing yams, and laughing louder than anyone else. The sun was just beginning to rise over Ouagadougou, casting long, golden shadows across the palace courtyard. Jasmine stepped outside for air, still carrying the quiet weight of the night before. The empty chair, the rusted spoon, the worn shoes, each memory still clung to her skin like morning humidity. She needed movement, a walk, a pause from everything. As she wandered past the side entrance, where the security fence met the old stone wall, her eyes caught something that made her stop. A girl, no older than 8. She was barefoot, her dress frayed at the edges, and a faded scarf was tied carefully around her neck, like someone had taken time to make her feel dignified, even in struggle. But it wasn't the girl herself that made Jasmine stop. It was what she was holding. A small piece of cardboard. Cut unevenly, the corners soft and curled from weather. Written across it, in shaky black marker, were 7 words. "Can you give my mama a chance?" The sentence wasn't dramatic. It wasn't begging. It was deliberate, honest. And Jasmine, rooted to the ground, suddenly felt like someone had cracked open the silence she'd been carrying. Before she could move, a familiar voice spoke beside her. "She comes every Friday," Traoré said. Jasmine turned. He had appeared so quietly, she hadn't even heard him approach. His jacket was unbuttoned, sleeves rolled halfway up, as if the presidency hadn't started yet for the day. But his eyes, those same deep-set eyes, were already awake. "She thinks if the president sees her, her mother will get work," he continued. "She doesn't ask for food or money, just a chance." Jasmine blinked. "Does she always bring the sign?" "Every time," he said. "Same one. She keeps it under a mattress, says it's her only important thing." The girl noticed them now and stepped forward hesitantly, not out of fear, but uncertainty. Her eyes darted between Jasmine and Traoré, then settled on the man she clearly recognized. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She just held up the sign a little higher, like a soldier lifting a flag. Traoré knelt slowly in front of her, reaching into his jacket. From the inside pocket, he pulled out a small folded paper. It wasn't fancy, just a single sheet, gently creased. He handed it to her without ceremony. She took it, looked down, then up again. "For Mama?" she asked, voice almost a whisper. He nodded. "It starts Monday. Presidential laundry service, full benefits, no cameras." She stared at the paper for a long time, then did something Jasmine didn't expect. She stepped forward and hugged him. Tight, like a child hugging an uncle she trusted with her entire world. Then, just as quickly she let go, turned, and ran back down the street. The cardboard sign fluttered behind her like a cape. Jasmine stood in silence, unsure if her heart had just broken or been restored. "You don't publicize this?" she asked, still watching the child disappear into the distance. Traoré shook his head. "Not everything needs a lens. Some stories deserve to live without applause." She turned to him. "You do this often?" "As often as I can," he said. "But it's never enough. We have programs, yes, policies, but what people really want isn't help. It's dignity." He paused, then added almost to himself, "Her mother didn't want charity, she wanted purpose. That's harder to give, but it lasts longer." Jasmine looked down the road one more time, and for the first time in her life, she realized that some of the most powerful leadership didn't happen in parliament halls or press briefings. It happened in moments like this: a quiet Friday morning, a cardboard sign, and a man who remembered what it meant to be unseen. She took a slow breath and whispered, "Some leaders build image, but this one builds lives." And Traoré, hearing her, said nothing, because sometimes silence is the loudest kind of truth there is. They walked together in silence, following the narrow pathway that curved behind the palace garden. Jasmine hadn't said a word since the little girl disappeared down the street. Her heart was still lingering in that moment, in the way the child hugged Traoré like he was hope made real, in the way that torn piece of cardboard had carried more weight than any campaign speech she'd ever heard. "You could have given them money," she said finally, her voice low, reflective. "Enough to buy food for months, pay rent for a year." Traoré nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. "I did, once." Jasmine turned to look at him. He kept his gaze forward, hands clasped behind his back, as if he were recounting something he'd lived through so deeply it had become part of his skin. "The first time I met her, I brought a bag of rice, some cash, enough for 2 months. I even arranged for a neighbor to deliver groceries. She thanked me, smiled. But the next week, she came back with the same look in her eyes." "Panic?" Jasmine asked. "No," he replied. "Shame." That word stayed in the air between them, too heavy to brush away. "She told me," he continued, "Mr. President, I don't need a bag of rice. I need a reason to get up in the morning." He glanced at Jasmine, his eyes steady. "That sentence changed the way I think about help." Jasmine felt it deeply. She had sat in committee meetings debating aid packages, welfare reforms, economic support. But never had she heard it phrased so simply, so heartbreakingly honest. "She didn't want relief," he said. "She wanted dignity. She wanted to earn something, to feel like her daughter could look at her and see more than need." They reached a bench beneath a neem tree and sat. The wind rustled the leaves above them, but the space between them remained still. Jasmine leaned back, staring at the sky through the branches. "She could have disappeared into poverty," she said, "like so many do, quietly, no voice, no sign." "But she didn't," Traoré replied. "She stood outside a gate with a sign made from a broken box, not to beg, but to be seen." Jasmine shook her head slightly, overwhelmed not by pity, but by admiration. "That's not weakness," she said. "That's strength most people can't even recognize." "She never asked for favors," Traoré added. "Not even when I offered more. She said, 'Give me soap and water, I'll take care of the rest.' So I made sure her contract included full benefits. She deserved to walk into a job, not a handout." Jasmine looked at him now, not as a head of state, not as a former soldier, but as a man who had understood something most governments forget. "Some leaders build image," she said, softly. "This one builds lives." He didn't respond right away, just looked out across the garden, where the city beyond was beginning to stir. Horns honked in the distance, vendors set up stalls, children chased each other barefoot along the edges of the road. Then he said, almost like a prayer, "One mother with a job can feed 3 children. That's more powerful than passing 100 laws." Jasmine didn't reply. She didn't need to. Because in that moment, under the branches of an old neem tree, she understood that power wasn't always in how loudly you spoke, but in how quietly you chose to see someone and gave them the space to stand tall on their own. They were walking back toward the palace gates when Jasmine saw her again. The same little girl, same scarf around her neck, standing at the same spot near the fence, but this time she wasn't holding a cardboard sign. She had both hands cupped together, gently protecting something from the wind. When she noticed Jasmine approaching, she stepped forward without hesitation. No fear, no uncertainty, just a quiet kind of purpose, like she had been waiting for this exact moment. Without saying a word, she opened her hands and revealed a tiny, handmade flower. It was folded from scraps of old paper. Pages from a torn notebook, creased and layered with surprising precision. The petals were lopsided, the center was taped, but it was whole, and it was beautiful in the way that only something fragile and intentional could be. She looked up at Jasmine and said softly, "For you, to remember Burkina Faso." Jasmine froze. Her throat tightened instantly. She crouched down slowly, taking the flower into her palms with a reverence she couldn't explain. It felt light, almost nothing, but something about it made her chest ache. The girl smiled, just a little, then turned and ran back toward the alley, disappearing behind a stack of crates, the scarf around her neck fluttering like a ribbon of quiet resilience. Jasmine stood up slowly, eyes still on the paper flower in her hand. It didn't smell like anything. It had no color, no value, no utility. And yet, it felt more significant than any document she had signed in Washington, more lasting than any speech she had ever delivered. She didn't say anything for a while. She just stared at it, turning it over gently with her fingers, afraid that gripping it too tightly might tear it. Traoré stood beside her, hands in his pockets, watching without interrupting. "Does she give those to everyone?" Jasmine finally asked. "No," he said, "only the ones she thinks will remember." Those words landed with the same quiet force as everything else he had said. Jasmine tucked the flower carefully into her jacket, not like a keepsake, but like a responsibility. As they stepped back through the palace gates, she felt something shift inside her. Not anger, not pity, but clarity. She had come here expecting a political visit, bullet points, talking points, policy discussions. Instead, she had been handed a paper flower by a child with no shoes, no wealth, no status, but a heart big enough to believe that a stranger from a world away might carry her story home. Jasmine knew, in that instant, that her career, her beliefs, her very definition of leadership had just changed. It wasn't about visibility or victory or votes. It was about being remembered by the right people, for the right reasons. And as she looked once more at the fading alley where the girl had stood, she whispered to herself, almost as a vow, "I won't forget, I promise." The drive outside the Capitol was quiet. No motorcade, no press. Just two cars gliding over dusty roads, their tires whispering through the silence of early morning. Jasmine sat in the back seat, hands folded in her lap, the paper flower still tucked safely into her coat pocket. She hadn't spoken much since they left the city. Something about this visit felt different, heavier. The building came into view slowly. A rural clinic, nestled between parched fields and rows of sun-baked homes, tin roofing curled at the edges, the walls marked with old cracks and fresh attempts to paint over them. It was humble, almost forgotten, but alive with the hum of mothers whispering, nurses walking, and children coughing in the background. Inside, the smell of antiseptic clung to the air, clean but never quite enough to mask the ache of poverty. Rows of small beds lined the narrow room, each holding a child wrapped in thin sheets, their chests rising and falling in shallow rhythms. There were quiet sobs, distant murmurs, and a fan that spun just slowly enough to make its failure feel personal. And then Jasmine saw it, the empty bed. It was at the end of the room, perfectly made, a clean sheet folded at the foot, a stuffed animal placed neatly on the pillow, facing no one. She felt her steps slow. The absence in that bed was louder than all the breaths around it. Traoré stopped beside her, hands at his sides. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper. His name was Thomas, he said. He was 8. His mother carried him here on foot, 18 kilometers, through dust, through heat. She didn't stop once. Jasmine swallowed the lump rising in her throat. It together. Had tuberculosis. Traoré continued. All he needed was oxygen, just enough to keep him stable while the antibiotics kicked in. She looked at the wall, where an old metal bracket still held the marks of a missing oxygen tank. "We called the capital," he said. "Begged. They sent one, but it came 2 hours too late." His words were calm, no anger, no blame, just a terrible, exhausted truth. "We repainted the walls afterward, fixed the fan, replaced the bed sheets, but that bed—" He paused, eyes fixed on the space where Thomas once lay. "That bed reminds me what leadership doesn't always give you: time." Jasmine's breath hitched. She reached out and gripped the frame gently, like touching it might bring back something, or someone. "His mother didn't cry when I met her," Traoré added. "She just kept asking the same question. Why couldn't we have saved one tank? Just one?" There was no answer. Sometimes there wasn't. Jasmine sat on the edge of the empty bed, her voice trembling. "You were the president, and you couldn't save him." Traoré nodded slowly. "Being president doesn't stop the system from breaking. It just means you feel it tear." The weight of that admission hung between them like a storm cloud, with nowhere to go. "I carry his name," he said, "in my journal. I read it every Monday morning, along with the names of every child we lost the week before." Jasmine looked up, stunned. "Every week?" "Every week," he confirmed, "because I can't fix what I don't face." She pressed her lips together, eyes burning, staring at the stuffed animal on the pillow. A rabbit, one ear torn, still waiting for a child who would never come back. "That bed," she said, "should be in a museum." "No," Traoré replied. "It should stay here, so that every doctor, every nurse, every visitor remembers what was lost while we waited." Jasmine stood, her hand still brushing the edge of the mattress. "And the next, Thomas," he didn't hesitate, "will breathe, even if I have to carry the tank myself." And in that room, surrounded by children fighting invisible battles, Jasmine understood a truth she had never considered before. Leadership isn't just about what you repair. It's about who you remember, while the world is still broken. The drive back from the clinic was unusually quiet. Jasmine stared out the window, but the passing fields, crumbling walls, and people on bicycles barely registered in her mind. Her thoughts were still in that room, with the children breathing shallowly, with the fan barely turning, with the bed that would never be filled again. She had interviewed prime ministers and debated governors, but none of them had ever said what Traoré had said back there. Being president doesn't always mean you can save someone in time. It echoed in her chest like a confession. But it hadn't been said with resignation. It had been said with reverence. For life, for time, for the fragile line between power and helplessness. At dinner that evening, Jasmine found herself barely touching her food. The grilled plantains, the stewed beans, all of it sat untouched. Traoré noticed, but said nothing. He didn't eat much either. The weight of that empty bed had followed them both. Finally, Jasmine spoke, her voice quiet. "How do you live with it?" He didn't need to ask what she meant. "I don't," he said after a moment. "Not all of it." He set his fork down and folded his hands, elbows resting lightly on the wooden table. "That bed. Thomas, I see him every time I walk past the children's ward, every time I read a weekly report, every time a mother thanks me for a medicine that came too late for someone else." She watched him closely now. He wasn't shielding anything. There was no wall, no polished rhetoric, only raw, aching honesty. "You're the president," she said slowly. "You command armies, pass laws, move millions in funding. And yet," he nodded, finishing her sentence, "and yet, I couldn't save an 8-year-old boy because a machine broke, because a truck was delayed, because I believed, naively, that systems would move as fast as intentions." The truth of that hit Jasmine hard. In Washington, leadership meant votes, alliances, headlines. But here, it meant facing children's names on Monday mornings and knowing that one line of bureaucracy could mean a funeral. Traoré looked down at his hands, calloused, steady. People think power means control, that it's the ability to change anything at will. But real power, he said, voice softer now, is knowing how limited you are and still choosing to try. She nodded slowly, her throat tightening. What do you tell the parents? I don't tell them anything, he replied. I listen, I sit with them. I let them talk, scream, cry, whatever they need. I don't show up as a politician. I show up as the man who failed their child. And they forgive you? Sometimes. Sometimes not, he paused. And I accept both. A long silence passed between them. The candle flickered on the table. Jasmine reached into her pocket and gently touched the folded paper flower the girl had given her earlier that day. Even that moment now felt heavier. What would you have done differently? She asked. He didn't answer right away. Everything, he said finally. And also, nothing. Because what haunts me isn't that I didn't act. It's that I acted, and it still wasn't enough. And there it was, the heart of all of it. The unbearable truth of leading with heart in a world shaped by limitation. He wasn't a savior. He was a man trying to hold back the ocean with cupped hands. That night, Jasmine wrote one sentence in her notebook. The most terrifying kind of power is the kind that arrives too late. Jasmine stood in front of the bed again long after the clinic had quieted. Visiting hours were over, staff were clearing the hallway, and the setting sun had begun slipping through the cracked window slats, painting the walls with soft streaks of orange and gold. The children in the room were sleeping now, or trying to, their soft breathing mingling with the low hum of the repaired ceiling fan above. But Jasmine's eyes stayed locked on the empty frame at the end of the row. She stepped closer, her fingers reaching out instinctively. When they touched the edge of the metal bed, she was startled by how cold it was. Not just cool from the evening air, cold like absence, like finality. She let her palm rest there a moment longer, as if the contact could conjure some warmth, some memory that wasn't hers to have. But nothing came. Only stillness. Behind her, Traoré stood watching. Not with ceremony, not with explanation, just quiet witness. We fixed the tank, he said finally, his voice gentle but solid. Repainted the wall, added more fans, we even replaced the linens. But that bed... He took a slow step closer, his eyes never leaving the space. That bed will always remind me who we lost while we waited. Jasmine closed her eyes. It was a simple sentence. No dramatic crescendo, no raised voice, but something in it felt like a stone dropped into her chest. She could see it so clearly now, not just the logistics, not the slow-moving equipment requests or the broken ambulance radios, but the faces. The mother walking 18 kilometers, the boy clinging to his breath, the staff powerless in the face of time. Do you think it'll ever stop feeling like this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No, Traoré replied. And it shouldn't. She opened her eyes, looked at him. There was no bitterness in his face, only weariness and resolve. An exhaustion not from lack of sleep, but from the weight of remembering. Every speech I give, he added, I carry this bed with me. Every time I sign a budget or approve a delivery truck, I see Thomas's face. He paused, then said quietly, Grief isn't the burden of a leader. It's the compass. Jasmine pressed her palm more firmly into the bed, as if trying to anchor that truth into her skin. She imagined the ripple that single broken tank had caused. A funeral, a life left unlived, a mother left asking questions that answers could never soothe. And yet here she stood, in a room that was now clean, quiet, whole, except for this one space, left untouched not by neglect but by choice, a memorial without flowers, a silence that said more than any plaque ever could. "We wait for so many things," Jasmine said finally, "and it's always the most vulnerable who pay the price for delay." Traoré nodded once, slowly. "Yes, but remembering them," he said, "is how we make sure we don't become the kind of leaders who wait comfortably ever again." And in that room, small, still, and haunted by both loss and love, Jasmine Crockett finally understood the true cost of hesitation. Not in votes, not in policy, but in tiny empty beds. The prison wasn't far from the capital, but Jasmine noticed how the air seemed to shift as they drove toward it. The roads narrowed, the city noise faded, and the view was slowly overtaken by dust, concrete, and silence. There were no cameras, no entourage, just Traoré in a plain shirt and sandals, as if he were returning not as president, but as something simpler, maybe even as someone asking for forgiveness. The gates creaked open with an almost reluctant groan. Guards offered quick salutes, but there was no ceremony. Inside, the courtyard was quiet, except for the distant clatter of tin cups and murmured conversation. A few prisoners glanced over as they walked through, more curious than hostile. Jasmine trailed behind, unsure what they were here to see, until they turned a corner and saw him. A man sat alone in a patch of shade beside the courtyard wall. He was older, with graying hair and a slight limp. He looked up, slowly, and Jasmine saw no fear in his face, only recognition. Traoré stopped a few feet away. "Asif," he said quietly. The man stood. His face held the weight of years, but his posture was steady, almost formal. "I didn't think you'd come," Yusuf replied. Traoré stepped closer. "I told you I would." Jasmine looked between them, heart pounding. There was tension in the air, but not the kind that threatened violence. It was deeper, like history that had never been spoken aloud. "CRIES was once on the other side," Traoré explained to Jasmine, without turning away. "During the uprising, we fought in the same streets, but for different flags." Jasmine nodded slowly, piecing it together. "You captured him?" Traoré hesitated. "I gave the order." Yusuf didn't flinch. "And I don't regret fighting for what I believed then, but I regret not knowing better sooner." There was a pause. "And now?" Jasmine asked. Yusuf smiled gently. "Now I teach young inmates to read." Jasmine blinked. "You teach them?" He nodded. "Every week. Volunteer only. I don't ask why they're here, I just tell them the alphabet still belongs to them." There was something so profoundly human in that statement, it almost took her breath away. "I've done things I'm not proud of," Yusuf added, "but if I can help someone else not carry that weight, maybe it means something." Traoré looked at him with eyes that held no pride, no pity, only respect. "I didn't come here to lead a country of perfect people," he said quietly. "I came to build a place where broken people still have a future." Yusuf nodded slowly. "And you're doing that." There was no handshake, no dramatic gesture, just two men, once enemies, standing in a prison courtyard, both changed, both carrying pasts that no sentence could erase. Jasmine felt a strange tightness in her chest. She had come here expecting justice to look like punishment. Instead, it looked like a man teaching others how to spell hope again, one letter at a time. They sat on two benches beneath the open sky of the prison courtyard, not far from the wall where Yusuf usually gathered his students. The air smelled faintly of rust and heat, but the wind was gentle, and for a moment the place felt less like a prison and more like a classroom that had forgotten its walls. Jasmine couldn't stop watching Yusuf. the quiet way he folded his hands, the care with which he spoke, as if each word had been filtered through years of silence before being allowed into the open. Something about him was calm. Not rehearsed, not hardened. Calm, like someone who had made peace with pain by sitting with it long enough to understand it. She finally asked the question that had been clawing at her since the moment she saw them face each other. "Why did you forgive him?" Yusuf looked at her, not surprised. He smiled faintly, like he had expected that question all along. "Because he changed," he said simply, "and so did I." Jasmine tilted her head. "Just like that?" "No," he said. "Not just like that. It took years, it took time, and it took pain." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know," he continued, "I hated him for a long time. Not because he arrested me, not even because of the war. I hated him because I thought he forgot I was human. I thought he only saw a rebel, a threat, an obstacle." Jasmine said nothing, just listened, breath held. "But then one day," Yusuf said, "he came here, not with cameras or speeches, not to make a show, just him, quiet, alone, and he sat right there." He nodded to the spot on the opposite bench. "He didn't say much," Yusuf added, "but he looked me in the eye, no excuse, no defense, just presence. And I saw something that day I hadn't expected." "What was it?" Jasmine asked. "Regret," Yusuf said. "Not weakness, not shame. Regret, the kind that sits deep in your bones." Jasmine glanced toward Traoré, who stood a few feet away, speaking with a guard. He looked ordinary, like a man who carried 100 ghosts in his pockets. Yusuf followed her gaze. "You see, forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of waiting for the other person to suffer." He leaned back, letting out a long breath. "If I had stayed angry, I would still be locked up in here even after I got out." Jasmine's eyes widened slightly. "So forgiveness is freedom?" "For me it was," he said. "Forgiving him didn't mean I erased the past. It meant I stopped living in it." The wind stirred again, lifting a few leaves from the corner of the yard. The guards didn't interrupt. No one did, as if the entire prison knew something sacred was being spoken into the silence. "He changed," Yusuf repeated. "And so did I. That's why I teach. That's why I stay. Because if we don't believe people can change, what's the point of building a future?" Jasmine felt her throat tighten. She hadn't expected this kind of clarity in a place designed for punishment, but here it was. Redemption, sitting in sandals with a chalkboard and a dictionary, shaping second chances, one lesson at a time. She looked at Yusuf again and whispered, "Do you think your students will forgive themselves too?" "I hope so," he said, eyes soft. "That's the only real kind of justice that heals." The palace study was modest by any presidential standard. No gold trim, no towering bookshelves, no ornate artifacts. Just a solid wooden desk, a faded map of Burkina Faso on the wall, and sunlight pooling in through tall, dust-speckled windows. Jasmine stepped in behind Traoré that evening, her gaze wandering curiously, almost hesitantly, across the room. But her eyes stopped at one detail. On a narrow shelf behind the desk sat a pair of tiny shoes, plastic, cracked, the soles worn thin. They were so small she nearly missed them. Translucent, pale blue, one strap barely hanging on. Nothing about them seemed presidential, but everything about them felt sacred. She stepped closer. "Whose are these?" Traoré walked toward the shelf slowly, not answering right away. He picked up the shoes with both hands, as if touching something fragile that could crumble under too much memory. "His name was Idrissa," he said finally. "He was 7. I met him at a displacement camp during the first wave of violence up north." Jasmine remained still, her voice soft. "Was he alone? Had no parents left, just an aunt who had taken him in. No shoes, just 2 plastic bags tied around his feet to keep the ground from burning him." She stared at the tiny shoes, her chest tightening. "Walked up to me," Traoré continued, "and said, 'You can walk farther than me, Mr. President, so here, take mine.'" He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I tried to give them back, told him he needed them more, but he insisted. Said he had seen me on a poster once. Said I looked like someone who wouldn't waste a gift." Jasmine's lips parted, but she couldn't find words. 3 days later, Traoré said quietly, "he died of pneumonia. We got medicine to the camp eventually, but not fast enough. Not for him." The silence in the room wrapped around them, thick and aching. The world outside the windows moved on. Cars passed, guards exchanged shifts, the city pulsed. But inside this room, time paused for Adressa. "I wanted to bury them with him," Traoré said, "but his aunt asked me not to. She said he believed I was different, that keeping them meant proving him right." He placed the shoes gently back on the shelf, adjusting their angles slightly, "like honoring an altar. Every step I take," he whispered, "is borrowed from someone who never got the chance." Jasmine felt the sting in her throat again. The same sting she'd felt in the clinic, the same sting from the girl with a cardboard sign, from the chair for Adama, from the empty bed. But this was something different. Because Idris's shoes weren't just a memory, they were a promise, a pair of reminders that leadership isn't about how far you go, it's about who let go so you could walk farther. She looked at the shoes one more time, and this time she didn't see poverty or tragedy. She saw purpose. It was late, almost midnight, when the call came. Traoré was alone in the hallway outside Jasmine's guest room, the palace lights dimmed, the city already asleep. Jasmine opened her door slightly, hearing the faint voice and seeing his face pale in the moonlight. "She's gone," he whispered. Jasmine stepped forward. "Who?" "The girl. The one I promised would be safe. She was taken by militants in the north last night." His voice cracked. "I spoke to her father just 2 days ago. I told him to trust me, that we were making progress." He leaned against the wall, hand over his eyes. "I promised her safety," he said again, lower this time. "Now I only have words." Jasmine stood beside him. "You carry too much alone." He didn't deny it. "Every name, every face, every promise I couldn't keep. They don't disappear when the cameras turn off," he said. His voice trembled, but he didn't cry. There was no breakdown, just silence, one that felt louder than grief itself. "And I will get her back," he whispered, "even if it's the last thing I do." And in that moment, Jasmine didn't see a president. She saw a man breaking quietly for someone the world would likely never even know existed. Their farewell dinner was humble. Grilled fish, beans, fried plantains. No guests, no ceremony, just 2 people, changed by days they hadn't seen coming. They ate in silence at first, the weight of the past few days lingering in every breath. Jasmine looked at the chair across from her, the one always left empty for Adama, and finally understood why it mattered so much. As they stood to say goodbye, Jasmine hesitated. Then, without thinking, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Traoré in a tight, full embrace. It wasn't professional, it wasn't planned, it was human. "Thank you," she whispered into his shoulder. "Thank you for being more than a title." He didn't move at first. Then, slowly, he returned the hug. One hand on her back, the other trembling ever so slightly. "Thank you," he said, "for seeing past mine." They pulled apart. Jasmine wiped her eyes and gave him a sad smile. "I didn't expect to feel this much." "Neither did I," he replied quietly. That night, as she lay awake, Jasmine didn't think of cameras or ratings. She thought of the shoes, the chair, the bed, the girl, and the man who carried them all. Back in the U.S., Jasmine sat in the editing studio, watching the footage again. She paused on one specific moment. The question she had asked spontaneously, when all scripted lines had long faded away. What's something you wish the world knew about you? Traoré had looked into the camera, calm, sincere, and said, I'm not trying to be perfect. I'm just trying to be the kind of man my mother would have been proud of. Jasmine insisted that the network air the interview uncut. No edits, no filters, just the truth. 4 days later, the video went viral. Tens of millions watched. Young activists posted reactions. Veterans shared it with tears. Mothers showed it to their sons. Teachers played it in classrooms. For once, the internet didn't argue. It just listened. Jasmine stood in the corner of the studio, hands trembling, as that one moment played on screens across the world. And 3 days later, she called Traoré. It's everywhere, she said. 50 million views, maybe more. His voice came through the phone, soft and steady. I never wanted to be a symbol. She smiled faintly. You became one anyway. He was quiet for a moment, then added, Make sure they don't just remember me. Let them remember the girl, the shoes, the boy, the man in prison. Those are the real stories. That night, Jasmine posted a photo of the paper flower the little girl had given her, now resting beside her microphone. The caption read, In a world of noise, one man spoke softly, and the world finally listened. This story reminds us that true leadership isn't measured by power, titles, or speeches, but by quiet strength, compassion, and the promises we carry for others. Ibrahim Traoré leads not from privilege, but from pain, memory, and purpose. Jasmine's journey reveals how listening deeply can open our hearts beyond politics. In a noisy world, sometimes the softest voices hold the most truth. It's not about saving everyone, but honoring those we couldn't save. What's one quiet moment in your life that changed how you see the world? We'd love to hear your story. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain's Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.